We will go to the second question, which will take me just a second to bring up. There we go. Okay, this is from Jimmy Jr., who says, my family and I attend a church that is in fellowship with an organization that uses water during communion instead of wine or grape juice. They attempt to use John 19:34 to justify this. And they also believe Jesus never consumed wine. Is this biblical? Let's tackle John 19:34 first. I'm trying to think where to start. Interesting. I've never even heard of this before. Any group that uses water instead of wine. I've literally never heard of it. So this is interesting. Now, your church, just to understand, you attend a church that's in fellowship with an organization that uses water instead of wine. I don't know if your church uses water instead of wine, or if you're just finding they're connected to this other group somehow. It sounds like they're just connected, and that it's not something your church does. So that will change how you analyze this stuff. Here's the Bible verse, though, that they use to say that we should drink water, not wine, or even grape juice in communion. 19:34 of John. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. At once there came out blood and water. That's ridiculous. Let's. I imagine this is how it goes in the church group. They preach, they get super preachy being the key word here, and then they quote John 19:34 and they preach more. But what they cannot do is draw a logical connection between communion, water as communion, and the fact that blood and water came out when Jesus was stabbed. Right? Probably it was either water that had pooled in the lungs during the torturous death of crucifixion, or it was the pericardium around the heart, which is like we call a water sac, right? It's not technically H2, just H2O. There's more going on there, but in normal language, which the Bible is written in normal language for the most part, you would have, we call it water. So, yeah, in no world would anybody read this passage who cares about just interpreting scripture carefully and use this as, this is a really weird thing. I don't know where this came from. I can't even think of an angle someone could come at. Blood and water came out. Well, if you think this is instructions about communion, then don't you have to drink blood and water, or wine and water in communion? So maybe you water down your wine. Right? Like, what about this says exclusively water, never do the thing that represents blood, which is, of course, wine or grape juice. In addition to this, just to answer briefly, they believe Jesus never consumed wine. Is that biblical? That is completely unbiblical and not historically true at all. I have a video that you may have seen, Jimmy Jr. If not, I will link it in the comments or in the video description below later. And mods, if anybody is available right now to do this, if one of you could mention or put, maybe, I guess only mods can post links, but I have a video on alcohol. If you guys could put that video on alcohol there, what the Bible really teaches about alcohol. In that video, I look at the actual Hebrew and Greek words themselves, and I look at the Jewish and Greek customs of the time, and they'll often say things like, well, the Greeks thought that the best wine was really super watered down, and it was like, well, that wasn't a Jewish custom at all, and Jesus was entirely in Jewish settings. Jesus actually made a bunch of wine in John chapter 2 at the wedding of Cana, and they said this was the best wine, and no, they did not, and this is important, they did not think that best wine meant it didn't have any alcohol in it. Now, I still don't drink alcohol, okay, so I'm not a proponent of drinking alcohol myself, like I don't do it myself, but I am a proponent that Jesus drank, because that just seems to be the case, and tons of evidence supports it, that drinking was something that was considered a blessing and a potential danger. So people can abstain from alcohol if they choose, but there is no necessity of not drinking alcohol. When the early church took communion, it was wine, not just unfermented grape juice. In my local Christian culture, we usually do just grape juice. That's fine. I don't think that that's a big deal. I don't think that it's like it counts or it doesn't count. I even think that if you drank water, instead of wine or grape juice, you're losing some of the symbolism that's represented there, but that the Lord knows your heart and he knows you're doing this in honor of Christ, and you're just confused about the nature of it a bit. I think that God understands that. And I wouldn't nitpick or disqualify people from saying that their communion doesn't count. So those are a few of my thoughts. I will share my alcohol video down below where I get into some of the claims that I've heard from those who try to promote that no one can drink. Drunkenness is considered a very serious sin in the Bible. No Christian should get drunk. You shouldn't even know what you're like when you're drunk because it never happens. That's, I think, a good godly rule for us to have. But alcohol itself is not inherently sinful. And it was Jesus absolutely drank alcohol. Never got drunk. He absolutely drank alcohol. The disciples absolutely drank it. Here is where we are confronted with the same issue the Pharisees were confronted with in the first century. They have traditions of man that are far more strict than the actual teachings of God. And it's really hard to let those go. But when you're confronted with Scripture and it makes it clear that these traditions are not present, it's time to let them go. The Pharisees taught the doctrines of men as if they were the doctrines of God. And that's sadly what happens in some cultures, and some church cultures on the topic of alcohol. And I don't drink, so don't proclaim for a second that this is, well, Mike's just trying to defend his own alcohol abuse and da-da-da-da-da. But yeah.